Hello, everyone. Welcome to this celebration of the publication of Love in the Post-Reconceptualist Era of curriculum work, written by Allan Michel Jales Coutinho. I'm Bill Pinar, coming to you from our home that rests on the ancestral land of the Sac people. A word about format, and then we'll start. After Allan summarizes what he has achieved here, Kieran, Forde, Ying, and Jill Morris will each pose a question. Afterward, if there's time, we'll try to keep this to 60 minutes. I'll ask if anyone else in attendance has a question. When not speaking, please mute your device. Okay, Allan, please proceed.
Thank you, Pinar. Give me 1 second so that I can share my screen. 1 second. Are you able to see my screen? So thank you, everyone. Thank you everyone for making the time to be present here with me today. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to share a little bit about my scholarship with you here from the University of British Columbia in the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people to speak about love for love. When I wrote curriculum work and social justice leadership a few years ago, I unfolded 7 tenets for curriculum work, one of which concerned the fortification of love. At that time, as a critical scholar, I realized that when I attempt to deconstruct several discourses and meanings, I also deconstruct the meaning of love in my autobiography. When I deconstruct these meanings, other meanings and sentiments started to circulate my becoming. In my study, I contended that people were not caring towards one another, but rather they had invested interest in relationships. As I continued to reflect on the meanings of care in my life, I questioned whether love existed, and I theorized a nexus commenced on care where that could be fortified. Later, I decided to write this new book to further articulate a theory on how curricularists can fortify love in their lives and in their work. I ultimately question, can we fortify love in an agonistic, antagonistic, and competitive world of becomings? My answer to this question is, yes, we can, but this is hard labor. And I personally believe this is a labor that we can only achieve through autobiographical inquiry. In this text, I just oppose discourses and unfold autobiography to position love as an ethics of caregiving. With 6 chapters, I study love through juxtapositions. I position love as an ethics of caregiving. I unfold autobiography to fortify love, and I discuss evaluations and actualizations since these are connected to how individuals and societies perceive self and authority in a hierarchical world of becomings. In chapter 2, I asked the question, where to begin this course if we're not in love? At that time, I wanted to investigate whether and how curricularists construed love in their scholarship. In juxtaposition, I realized I affirm not only difference, but also relationships. And I realized that despite differences around the subject of love, several curricularists, they construed discourses attending to love, but a love of different kinds. Sometimes love is positioned as an awareness, sometimes love is positioned as a responsibility or as a sentiment. Curriculars have theorized love differently, sometimes associating love to care, sometimes adding other elements to love, sometimes contrasting love to hate. But the most critical insight is that love has been positioned as both a means to engage in war and end war. Love is also paradoxically constrained and operationalized by power which is produced by hierarchies. In this state, love can be conceived through power, otherwise it is considered anemic. But power also constrains experiences with love in the world. Such power makes caring for and about a complicated conversation in a hierarchical world of becomings. As a curricularist, I personally associate care to love as a normative and imaginative ethics of care. love that attempts to support genuine hospitality in receiving authority in their most vulnerable state without having to gain something in exchange. I argue here that we do not associate care to love because love is transfigured by hierarchies in power in the world. We negotiate love rather than proliferate love in our state of becoming. In chapter 3, I attempted to position an ethics of caregiving within curriculum studies. I asked the question, again, does love truly exist? As I did in my first book, I focus on the course of development, but at this time to demonstrate that power transfigures our experience with genuine love and hospitality in the world. I say that in the beginning, there was love, a time where people gave and received care from within, a moment in time where there was no structures and no power to mediate our relationships. But the course of development unfolded before our daring eyes. Due to increasing in population, new social hierarchical structures, more complex than the previous ones, started to emerge to maintain order and security in development. Through the accumulation of energy and power, the social hierarchies became institutionalized, a cyclical and iterative process. Because of social hierarchies, which are here represented by this triangle, this pyramid in the middle of the slide, we began to experience political phenomena, conflicts for survival, showing intergroup solidarities in the course of development. Conflict has become tantamount to development, and negotiation of care in the midst of human rights discourses a lexicon for becoming. Metaphorically, the course of development can be associated with the Eden. We departed Genesis, a place of energy sharing, because a snaked ego lured humans to grab the frontier, which is here represented by the apple. Humanity followed suit and started to fight to control and to garner power, thus initiating the era of the Anthropocene. I therefore ask the important question, can we proliferate rather than negotiate love in a hierarchical world? My understanding is that love, the ethics of care, is Genesis, a place of care and creation. When we collectively run from a fortified nexus of love, a standpoint where we are invited, in the words of Hooks, to return to love in the very course of development, we aspire to go to a place where no structures and power shape and dictate the unfolding of our human-non-human relations. We are called upon to care for and about the dignity, well-being, and flourishing of all, being open to give and receive from within. That is, to exert genuine hospitality, followed by solidarity. In imagining such a world, I attempt to unfold a new synthesis for development, one that skews from order and security and well-being to love and genuine hospitality, rather than just solidarity. In positioning love as an ethics of caregiving, I invite curricularists to return to love in their regressions and to imagine a world in their progressions where love is not transfigured. I assert that difference exists in the world, regardless of power and structures. Think, for example, about your encounters in nature, here represented by these 3 leaves in the slides with different colors. Difference exists in spite of power and structures. Difference exists in the world no matter what. However, we organize difference in hierarchies through power, which are the politics of care, especially via evaluations, which are here represented again by this pyramid. We can therefore name love and conflict. We can name difference in love or difference in conflict represented by the pyramid. So the important question is, how can we teach difference from love? To answer this question, I highlight and encourage curricularists such as myself to engage and to center Indigenous scholarship in their thought. Likewise, I argue that the tenacious work of the curricularist should be focused on paradoxical structures of development, which seek to promote order and security, and at the same time, promote well-being. I conclude that, quote unquote, the tenacious work of the curricularist should be focused on these paradoxical structures, a commitment to erase webs of privilege and oppression, while turning vulnerability and suffering amid them, helping our constellations of care fulfill, overflow, and ultimately replace these spaces and structures with love, the ethics of care, and its symbiotic and relational powers. I say that in a hierarchical world, we may diverge by providing greater and differentiated care to the most vulnerable, but we still converge by caring relationally and contextually for all. Because of social deliberations, I conceive a few lessons which I'd like to share with you. The first one is that care is love, however transfigured it becomes within the hierarchies of power. The second is that care must be given, not provided, not afforded to all. Care which is new, different, and yet common. Care to learn about authority, care to understand one's privilege, care to build a more relational world of becomings, a world where vulnerability and suffering constitute a rhythm, a place where great levels of well-being are shared across the spectrums of diversity. Based on these lessons, I unfold autobiography with despising a theory of change, the same theory that I said a few moments ago, which is we are able to fortify love in a hierarchical world in both lexis and praxis, in our regressions and progressions, and in our critical analysis for a new synthesis. Knowing that nation states also constitute a unit of analysis in curriculum in internationalization, and knowing that nation states always also dwell in solidarity, I conclude this chapter by asking whether it would be possible for nation states and curricularists to teach history as the course of running, emphasizing how we departed a position of love and hospitality to one of solidarity, and how we could return to a position of love and development. I argue that the decay of love constitutes the most profound crisis of curriculum in internationalization. In chapter 5, based on the primacy attributed to generalizations and evaluations in societies, I ask which kind of societies would be able to deliver justice without employment of assessments. I speak about the object of evaluations and contrast two forms of mindsets and discourses, judgmentalities and subjective mentalities, lifelong discourses and actualization. We use evaluations in the world to compare and contrast, and to deliver all forms of justice in a hierarchical and meritocratic system. However, through evaluations and our judgmentalities, we also employ deficit thinking approaches to rank people, sometimes even ascribing guilt and shame too. Conversely, through subjective mentalities, one is able to embrace the qualitative ways of knowing to understand reality, which is complex, paradoxical, antagonistic, and agonistic. In contrast to lifelong discourses, one becomes self-actualized when one engages in academic study, befocalizing the running of the course to study structures and power, privilege and oppression. When one actualizes, one seeks context ongoingly, citing Maxine Green, and most importantly, one is willing to exude caregiving as relational and contextual means for personal and collective unfolding. Rather than creating external means for an external body that needs to evaluate whether someone has reached a specific mark, actualization invites work from within while looking outwards, a sensitive, reflexive practice for becoming. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Allan. Kieran?
Thank you, Dr. Pinar, and thank you to Allan. Right, well, firstly, my congratulations on the publication of this book. It's great to be here today with you and the others in attendance to be able to unpack some of the many themes and ideas that your text explores. And your presentation was extremely helpful as well to sort of stir up and provide some insight into the themes of a book that I'm sure to return to. There's a lot there. So to get us started, and I may have time for a follow-up question, I'd like to start by asking you to share your thoughts on perhaps one of the lighter themes you raised. So I'm going to just share some sections that caught my attention. So I was looking at playfulness within your work. And just some passages where this came up, that curriculum work consists of a side of and for playfulness, of which complicated conversations are its cornerstone, the very character of curriculum studies, subjective, social, communicative, cosmopolitan, and whose setting of tone can forge a path towards justice. I stopped and looked at that. It's curriculum work and playfulness, just the juxtaposition of those words caught my attention. And then later, when I saw it again, by understanding curriculum in its multiple forms as an object and subject, its intellectual, contextual histories, and its present circumstances, locally and globally, we can also deconstruct it and rewrite it, and in playfulness, bring the vertical and horizontal structures of the discipline together, even if tentatively, into a whole, that is, into a nexus. So that second reference, again, caught my eye. And when it came across a third time, I was like, I'm going to have to ask about this. And so later in the book, you mentioned differences exist regardless of power and structures, but structures and power capabilities have organized difference in the course of development. We can name difference in love, and we can name difference in conflict, which is a different type of naming. Naming a conflict is immediate. There is no playful wonder, only dismissive hypothesis and assumptions leading to questioning at best. In love, wonder proliferates, culminates in conversation. In fact, wonder might become replaced by sentiments of familiarity, which are intrinsic to relationality and love. So those three mentions of play, playfulness spurred me to ask the question. I'm hoping you might speak to that need for play and playfulness in curriculum work, and in K-12 curriculum perhaps, and curriculum studies generally, and in curriculum of the self.
Thank you, Kieran, for your question. I speak about playfulness because curriculum is often understood as a standardized object in the world. And when students go to they run the course of schooling, they're going there to become a professional most of the time. They are they don't usually engage with autobiographical inquiry. And that's one of the major criticisms of my scholarship. And when I talk about playfulness, I usually engage in text through a postmodern perspective. I usually state that we conceive the world as an object with specific meanings. And in my career, when I do regressions and progressions, we have to be able to conceive the world differently in playfulness, because everything becomes a standard today. The curriculum becomes a standard, the profession becomes a standard, the subject becomes a standard, an object in the world. And then my question is, can we conceive ourselves as a subject, someone who lives, who experiences, who suffers, who loves? I believe that we can, and we can do that only, my theory, through autobiographical inquiry, by engaging autobiographical in curriculum, this objectified, I'm gonna say phenomena, which we all experience not only in schools, but also institutions, in higher education institutions, and even in I'm gonna say institutions outside of academia. So playfulness for me has become important when I started to engage autobiographically. How can we engage in playfulness, in a playfulness act with students in K-12? I'm not a teacher. I know my position here as someone who has, quote unquote, become a scholar who is producing scholarship, and someone who is attempting to unfold the theory through career and critical bifocality to conceive the world differently. So we have structures in the world, we have hierarchies, we have higher education institutions such as the University of British Columbia, which has a structure. We have professors, we have students, and we're all operating within structures. So how can we play within these structures? How can we change these structures? The most important, this is why I engage with critical bifocality, speaking about the curriculum that we experience in higher education institutions. How can we conceive higher education institutions differently? How can we conceive a doctoral program differently so that students can engage autobiographically, not only thinking about how they're going to become, let's say, a professor, but a professor who can engage autobiographically with their students and vice versa. So playfulness for me is similar to autobiography. We can de-standardize curriculum by engaging autobiographically, not only via texts, writing texts, but through the arts as well. And I think the most meaningful experiences I had as a student, as someone who taught as well, is via the autobiographical axis, via the arts, and by engaging knowledge. And the canonical curricular question for me reverberates: what knowledge is of most worth? And thinking ethically, right, as well, like how can we engage with new knowledges that have been not only have been conceived through time, but not valorized as knowledge of most worth. So for me, playfulness is a theme that is intrinsic to autobiography, and curriculum is not autobiographical. So how can we engage in playfulness? By making the curriculum, by supporting the curriculum to become subjectified, by engaging with autobiography.
Thanks, Allan. Just to my understanding, then you're talking about playfulness being around destandardizing and allowing for serendipity and the unfolding of autobiographical exploration. That makes sense. I'm also conscious of being scholars and having the privilege to play gracefully with ideas, as we are here today, and you did so well within your book. I think I have time for a quick follow-up on a similar theme, because I mentioned when I emailed you on that my first thought when I received the preprint was of Carl Lego's Living Love piece, The Confessions of a Fearful Teacher. And so the connection I made was strengthened when you started quoting from Hübner. And the comments you talked about here, that between 61 and 63, Huber questioned the adequacy of the elementary curriculum, claiming that curriculum didn't lack knowledge of the world, but rather responsibility. Curriculum has not yet found adequate ways to emphasize and maintain the love and excitement that children have for the world. The most important question, Huber argued, is whether we who are living love in the world. And these are the words I'm curious about here. On that similar theme of playfulness, for Huber, curiosity was tantamount to responsibility for the world, an enthusiasm that a limited ongoing excitement to sustain our collective existence in the world. And this responsibility derives from enthusiastic, joyful participation in the world. So I'm interested maybe in hearing a little on your comment for this need for curriculum to preserve and nurture curiosity and excitement and enthusiasm and joy so that we can love ourselves and others. And it's sort of related to this this duality perhaps of belonging and becoming, this iterative idea of belonging and becoming, and how those elements can be brought together. They can be reconciled using that word in your definition of the book, how belonging and becoming can be reconciled through curriculum by promoting curiosity and joy and these things which schooling is in great danger of eliminating.
Thank you, Kieran. I never articulated in my scholarship, I think in a clear way, the relationship between belonging and becoming. But I mean, for me, they are definitely associated. But when I think about curiosity, I think also about the ways in which we attempt to control, to create policies and laws, to create order and security in development. And we do so, when we do so, we don't promote curiosity. We have an end, right? It's a very it's a tailored approach. We have an end in mind always when we think about policies and laws, which is we ought to create order and security. So it's an ends means approach. And then my question is, even when we conceive curriculum as planned, there's always, a type of citizen that we are conceiving, which is the responsible citizen, the caring citizen. We come up with a construct, and then the concept of playfulness come into play for me, and the concept of ethics, right? I mean, we want to be able to engage ethically in the world, but for me, when I engage with, at least with Curere, I'm always engaging with Curere in the present moment, looking at the past and thinking progressively as well. And I think, how can we conceive a world that has no structures, that people are able to give care without having to negotiate it because of those structures and power? And that for me is part of the curiosity, because we don't live in social world. It is an ethics that is imaginative. Can we conceive a world that does not exist? And can we think about social world, by engaging with, because the knowledge, the theory for me constraints as well, right? Theory places boundaries. Can we think outside of those boundaries that the theories allow us to think with? So I'm always thinking, can we conceive our world differently? And that for me is part of the curiosity, and the curiosity that curriculum should foster in schools, instead of just thinking, okay, we have an ends-mean approach. We have, we have an input, which is, this is the knowledge of most worth. And we have an outcome, which is, this is the citizen, the responsible citizen, the caring citizen that is going to, enter a profession and deliver the outcomes that they're supposed to deliver. So I engage with Cureri, and I think about structures, and I think the curiosity comes into mind. And as you said, belong as well. Which kind of world we want to belong to.
Awesome. Thank you, Allan.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kieran. Dr. Ma.
I just unmute myself. Thank you so much, Allan, for your sharing. And I feel very honored and happy to join your book launch, and especially your thought help us to ponder more on the very important topic of today, love and care. So I will share my screen and pose my question to you. So can you see my screen? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
No.
So love in the post-reconceptualist era of curriculum work. So I'm kind of struck by the title of the love, of course, is a central theme of the book. So this book's premise, as the author states in the beginning of the book, is a fortification of love collectively and to give care from within. So I believe this book does not only juxtapose different notions of love in and beyond curriculum to afford a rich texture of love, but also embody the love fortification and proliferation through autobiographical inquiry and deepen it with the ethics of caregiving. So on page 49, the author states, at the end of the day, despite the differences in approaches, the convergence for care is love itself. Care to learn about authority, care to understand one's privileges, care to build a more relational world of becoming or becomings, a world where vulnerability and suffering constitute a myth, a place where great levels of well-being are shared across spectrums of diversity, where love is reverberated. So as you can see, I also copied and pasted the visual image of the author's Jales Coutinho's creation of this wonderful picture. And I feel the convergence and divergence of love, and it's very dynamic and fluid movement. And I find an argument of the convergence in divergence through with care and very appealing. So in contrast to the common metaphor of, for example, Canadian diversity as a mosaic, it's a very static and motionless picture. But this picture, I believe it captures the dynamic process, where the dynamic movement of converging and diverging movement of love and in the realm of diversity. So my question for this quote and this picture is, I understand the care, like giving care, has a cohesive energy as you depicted in the picture. So the care is where the people come together and understand each other despite of their differences. So they understand one another, get connected with one another. And I love the image of the reverberation of love through and with care. So indeed, I believe the convergence for care, or the love as claimed by the author, is very much needed in today's very chaotic and often segregated world. So my question is, could you elaborate more or give us example, tell a little bit more about the care for convergence is love itself? because I believe you build very interesting conceptual connections between love and care. So, and in this particular sentence, and you mentioned about the care for convergence, I understand convergence is commonality and coming together is love itself. And also, I noticed that in your book, you mentioned about care a lot, especially giving care. So my question arises about caregiving. So will caring or caregiving too much about the authority or the world make us kind of lost? Because, in today's very chaotic world, we have to say, and we are kind of overwhelmed by information from others or news and in the social media. So how could we protect our inner space from being overwhelmed or fused in the converging energy of caregiving? How could we dwell or dance in the creative tension between our singularity and connectivity, between our self-care and caring about others and the world? So thank you so much. This is my question. So do you prefer to look at the question, or I will stop sharing my screen? I believe I will stop sharing and you can respond.
It would be lovely if you could leave your questions there for me, because I think these are very important questions. Okay. And I would like to speak about, about all those three questions that you shared with us today. Thank you for taking the time to read the book and for sharing these thoughts with us. When I speak about care, I theorize that we, as humans today in a hierarchical world, that it might sound a little bit harsh, that we do not know what true love is, because love has already been constrained and dictated and constrained by power and hierarchies. I imagine a world in a regression where there's no structures, where love, was pure energy. I believe that we are spiritual beings in the world, and that we might still come into a moment in time where you are able to experience genuine care and genuine hospitality, love itself in its most genuine form. And that's, for me, that is love that converges, and that is the love that we have, and which is transfigured in our daily encounters with the unknown, with authority. For me, I find the most profound encounters that I have with love have been with my mom and in nature. But these are relationships that are still constrained by power and structures. And then when I regress and I attempt to go to a progression, I think about what a world, how can we construct or build a world where we can experience that kind of love, where people give and receive from within without having to exchange something in return, without having this immense mentality, which we all have, which is intrinsic. It has colonized our thinking. And this is why I say that that love is the care that converges. It's a paradoxical statement, a statement that, for me, speaks to spirituality as well, and to the fact that we all care about others and about the self. And which brings me to your question, which is, should we not protect ourselves from, I'm going to say the craziness that happens in the world? And for me, when I engage with autobiography, this is, a relational praxis. There's a self, there's an ego, but the self is always connected to someone else, to other contexts. And in the course of development, we become alienated. And we forget sometimes that these connections exist and that we are connected in the world. And the work of curriculum for me is to bring back those contacts and those relations. And when we care for, it may seem, okay, we should care for myself, we should not care for someone else. But for me, when we study structures, and this is why I like critical bifocality a lot, we attempted to change the structures not only for the self, but for everyone. This is a collective project, and a project that, of course, is a project of hurt, because we are, in a world that is hurtful. a world that negotiates care. So I think that imagination and curiosity has, a big plays a big role here in curriculum, in career for me. Another point that I would also like to raise is that when I regress and I deconstruct, let's say I have had several encounters with multiple people, with my mom, that were not loving. I could regress and come up to a moment in time, and in order to reconstruct those moments, I can study, the type of oppressions that my father, my family, my professors, they all experience in their relationships with me, and attempt to study how those structures shape their becoming as well. It's all relational and it's communal. So I think that this is, an important study, an ethical commitment to engage in autobiography, and by engaging with critical bifocality and by engaging with career, we are not only caring for ourselves, but for other people and for the world, in general. So, it's a commitment to make ourselves vulnerable and to engage and study these structures, and to know that when I engage in career, I'm gonna go back in time and reactivate the past and experience moments that that were hurtful. But how can I reconstruct those experiences for not only for myself, but for those people who are also with me, suffering and being oppressed and engaging, and also being privileged in other contexts. So this is the work that I attempt to do via autobiography, and this is also it also speaks to the inner space, because I think this is a calling. I say in my book, my first book, this is a calling, and a calling that we curricularists should be able to embrace as we engage with curriculum inquiry. And the final question, this tensionality. I think there's a tensionality indeed, because we are in hierarchies, right? And there's push and pull, but I'm imagining a world where through our care, we can converge, and yet in divergency, because this is a complicated conversation. If it was not, this would be a standard conversation. And that is not what curriculum espouses.
Thank you very much, Allan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ying. Jill.
Thank you, Bill. And thank you, Allan, for the opportunity to speak to you about your work. I enjoyed the reading, and I enjoyed the thinking. I think that it's something, the topics that you're dealing with, they also fill my head and the work that I'm doing. And they're very difficult to speak about, in part because they ask us to sort of move outside of the tangible. And often in when we speak about curriculum, there's sort of the unspoken between the conceptual and the practical. And I don't want to really open that messy nest, but I think my question is going to in some ways. So I'm just going to share the question that I have. Okay. So in the 5th chapter, you do some interesting work where you're discussing the difference between evaluation and actualization. And I was really excited about this, in part because as a scholar who has also spent a lot of time in the K-12 classroom, I'm really interested in the way that some of these ideas can become, can be picked up by folks that are doing work in the K-12 arena. And so you pose evaluation as that which is sort of this against an outside external standard, and actualization as an internal realization. And as you went on about this, you had this very interesting passage to me. So you write that it's unlikely that a curriculum that supports actualization through a nexus of love will be standardized. You also note that while external evaluations may support the subject during initial processes of actualization, there might be a moment in the unfolding wherein external evaluations become obsolete. What I was taken with here is that you're sort of holding this space for the standard, as well as sort of this ideal that you're imagining. So when we're theorizing this curriculum of potentiality, that's sort of how I'm envisioning your ideas here. It's moreness, the way that Huebner would talk about it, and the term that you use of proliferation. By the nature of these conceptions, we don't know, right, what will emerge. Like my sense of the conditional here is that you want to hold it open for what could possibly come out of this. And I really appreciated that. But when we are hoping to conceive of a curriculum that goes beyond in this way, defying the standardization and the oppressive implications of that kind of a curriculum, what sort of, let's say, obsesses me a little bit is like, what conditions have to exist to bring this about? So I'm hoping that you can speak a bit to your understanding of the tensions between standardization, evaluation, and actualization. And I'm wondering if some form of standardized curriculum and external evaluation is actually necessary, potentially, right? Some kind of like provocation for that actualization. So I'm thinking in terms of, I took from what you had written that we would perhaps potentially arrive at a place where we would, as you said, to come back to a place where these structures are not necessary. And could you speak to that a bit? Because I'm wondering if even in our individual process, maybe those standards are actually vital to that process of becoming.
Thank you for this very important question, Jill, and for mentioning the tensionality between quote unquote the theoretical and the practical, and I would say even the policy levels, which I hope to conceive into an axis. I think they're all interconnected. And I think one of the reasons why when I think about standardizations, I like to think, why do we have them, right? And I think about countries such as, my home country, Brazil, the United States, they established standards because we had universalization policies and more students came into the educational system and they had to establish the minimal levels of learning. That's one of the most important theories of change associated with curriculum as planned. If you go to, the government, to a government organization to conceive curriculum as a document. The standardization for me, so it has one theory of change. It established criteria, and it is important for some individuals because, for example, I came from a place where knowledge of most worth was quote unquote basic knowledge. People have very basic quote unquote basic levels of math and science. And to have access to this knowledge is important because that's how mobilizing knowledge in autobiography for me constitutes a critical praxis for conscientization. And what happens in curriculum is that we establish the standards, right? So that people achieve the minimal level of learning, but we usually don't implicate ourselves autobiographically with that knowledge. So the standards for me, sometimes, I don't, when I conceive this new world without evaluations, it is a possibility in a progression that, it doesn't exist today, let's say in Canada, in the municipality, in the school, but it might exist in the future. And then the question for me is how to, exactly that's the point, how can we actualize that world as individuals, as teachers? How, and then for the answer for me is we ought to engage autobiographically, but how can we do that? Of course, I'm not a science teacher, I'm not a math teacher, so I don't have all the answers to these questions, but I think we as teachers should be inquiry how we can promote autobiography, center autobiography in curriculum so that the students can implicate themselves, through this knowledge so that they can understand the world and themselves in relation. So it's not only about learning about specific content, it's understanding content in relation to the self and in relation to authority and in relation to the world, which is unfolding. So again, it's a possibility. I conceive a normative ethics and a position imagination as an important venue for people to imagine a world differently, and then study how can we conceive this world, how can we transform this world, knowing that there are external structures of development in place which are always demanding of us order, security, and our well-being due to human rights discourses. I do not have all answers. My theory is that we all ought to engage autobiographically. And then my invitation is that teachers and curricularists, theorists, policymakers, they engage in this complicated conversation to understand that curriculum is autobiography. Curriculum is the course of running, is studying the past to understand the future, to analyze both past and present, and to come into a synthesis, and to change the synthesis, which is development. So for me, this is an ongoing project, and this is why I am, in this engaging with my scholarship to understand how we can do that in schools, and having the support of lovely people to help me get that understanding as I move forward, studying curriculum.
Thanks, Allan.
Thank you, Jill.
Thanks very much, Jill. Is there anyone in attendance who would like to ask a question?
I ask a question?
Yes, on you,
Yeah.
Professor Walton.
Well, it's I haven't read the book, so probably my question is answered in the book in the way that I don't really know, but it has been really intriguing to hear, Allan, you conceptualize the notion of love and its relationship with autobiography and the curriculum studies. It's very interesting, and and I'm going to build my question a little bit upon Dr. Ma's and Kieran's question as well, especially Dr. Ma's question, because your project is built upon this notion of love as relational and the notion of the self or personhood as relational. And that's a very important notion. And if we consider the relational orientation of this project, then the self and the other are mutually embedded in each other. So when care or love is conceptualized as given, could you elaborate a little bit more? And I understand when you talk about providing care to the vulnerable persons, and also especially in a collective sense. Could you think about the element of receiving as well in this notion of love, if self and the other are already mutually embedded in each other? So when love and the care is only one direction given, then, as Dr. Ma talks about the self-care, self-care is not in the sense of the self as an isolated person, but I'm just speaking about the relationality in your, in your notion of love. So what's the other direction looks like, and how the giving and receiving interact with each other?
Thank you for your question, Professor Wang. When I wrote my first text and wrote this second text, I talk about love and trust and relationality. And I say that our relationalities are corroded in the course of development because of hierarchies and conflict. So I imagine a time in the course of history, human history, where people, they interacted with one another, where they trusted one another without having any constraints. But then there was a time, and then I speak about hospitality, right? I trust someone, I give trust, right? Some people give trust when they meet authority. They're relational, right? They're relational, even though they do conceive themselves relationally. They give trust. Sometimes people, they don't give trust, they build trust. I make that differentiation in the book. So sometimes you go to a community where people give trust, they meet you in the first time, they bring you to your house and they welcome you. And sometimes you go to other communities, who unfortunately doesn't trust authority as much because of the course of development. So I relate love and trust, and I relate love and hospitality in receiving the other. I receive the other because I trust you, because I love you. And in the course of development, we shift this, this state of being, which is loving self and authority as one, and come into a position of solidarity, where one dwells in conflict continuously. And then people start to eschew love and not to trust one another, and play games in prisoners' dilemmas and corrode trust, and it's a cyclical process. And then the question is, we are relational beings. Sometimes we don't conceive ourselves as relational and contextual beings because we use comparative thinking and comparative analysis, especially because of evaluations. So my question is, how can we reconceive and reconstruct ourselves, especially via query, so that we can see ourselves as this relational being that you talk about, someone who loves, who is hospitable, and who is at the same time someone who dwells in solidarity, but a solidarity that is embedded in love. That is the synthesis that I think that I came to a conclusion when I was thinking about development and engaging with query. So yes, I think that self, and authority, they are related, but sometimes we don't perceive ourselves as relational beings. And that's one of the most important works that curricularists ought to do, is to bring that contextuality and that relationality back to life. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anu. Any other questions?
Yeah, if I could jump.
Yeah, please.
Hi, folks. Thanks, everybody, and thanks especially, Allan, for sharing, your wonderful ideas. And I so appreciated the questions that were asked today. I mean, my mind is just sort of firing in so many directions, which is, I guess, the richness of conversations like these. There's a real thread of hope in this book, that argument that you have that it's, that it is actually possible in these existing structures that we might find genuine hospitality. And I want to kind of go back to Jill's nest of the theoretical and the practical and land somewhere in the practical side of things. For context, I'm a PhD student over at the University of Toronto, and I'm at a stage in my own academic career where I'm really grappling with the question of whether the academy can be a space for genuine hospitality. I guess I'm curious, Allan, you had said earlier when you were conceiving of what a PhD program or what other sort of academic spaces, how maybe autobiographical inquiry, playfulness, and curiosity, that maybe those are key ingredients to some of that hospitality. But I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what possibilities there are, or what you imagine a genuine hospitality as practiced within the sort of the structures, the existing structures, the academy that most of us, I think, are navigating right now. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. I'm looking for hope, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Thank you. Well, I'm new to the academy. I am, I'm the first PhD, person to perceive a PhD in my family. So I'm always learning what academia is all about, and what is called, what this construct of what a scholar is, and what does it mean to produce a scholarship and share scholarship. And one of the things that, that I notice is not only higher education institutions are just, a part of the pyramid. It's just like, right, it's just in the top there, there's a structure, and there's always comparisons and evaluations and people, you know, trying to evaluate the quality of the scholarship, and then conceiving a world otherwise. You know, I was even thinking some of these a few days ago, whether we could in the future do, you know, write theses collaborative, you know, with people. Could that be possible in academia? Could we engage in scholarship where two people could write, you know, a dissertation together and share thoughts and not, you know, we talk about intellectual property today. It's a very neoliberal way of, you know, conceiving knowledge. It's your property, you know, right? Your rights as the author, you know. Can we conceive? Then my question is, can we conceive a doctoral program differently? Can we conceive higher education institution differently? Because the structures are there and they're there for a reason. But then in order to change the structures, we have to change ourselves. And then we have to think, am I able, can I act in a way that is not, you know, through a competitive lens? How am I going to be feeling? You know, it's a work from within that we have to do in order to change structures and to conceive structures otherwise. So that's one of the possibilities that I thought, would that be possible? Why and why not? Right? And how can we, you know, conceive leadership differently as well? So, you know, I like to engage in career because of that, because I have to study the past. I have to activate the past. I have to look into progressions and into possibilities and think, is that possible? And I come to analysis. I mobilize knowledge, critical knowledge, to, you know, question these very structures and these very experiences that we have in academia and beyond, and come into a synthesis, which is the present moment, and continue to do that work ongoingly, because it's not a linear process, and it will never be.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thank you. Well, thanks to each of you for these questions. Especially thanks to the panel members, Jill Morris, Ying Ma, and Kieran Forde. And of course to you, Allan. Congratulations again on the publication of the book. If today is any signal, it will provoke a number of questions and considerations and reflections. Thanks again to all, and take care.